you. Now, this is all kind of fun, right? And it doesn't really matter. Yes, we understand ourselves and we understand the world around us through this computational way of thinking. Is that necessarily so harmful? Is that necessarily so bad? So I want to run us through sort of the implications and the limitations of that computational thinking on three levels, both on the global, sort of the societal level, on the interpersonal and the social level, and on the personal level, right? Because I promise you we're talking about the personal. Ultimately, we're talking about your decision making. And this is, the overarching thing I want you to take into consideration here is if we think computationally, computers work in tasks, right? They formalize let's say, the imprecise into something that's something or something else that becomes a task that you can execute in one single way. That's very helpful, but is it enough for all of us? So on the global level, an example I like to use here in how we treat the world around us as this computational entity is how we treat science, how we treat sort of not how scientists treat science, but how we societally talk about science as sort of this cold, hard fact machine, right? Like empirical research goes in, facts come out, like an algorithm, basically. If you look at the history of science, though, there's a lot of things that were called science before that we would be appalled by right now, that we wouldn't, and actually sort of the tradition of science is to find things, to refute them, to find other things, to refute those, etc., right? So to make incremental progress. If you look at the science from the time of like colonialism, right? Because that's where I think we need to be very careful, is that if we treat science as this cold hard fact machine, we forget the fact that it is very much culturally embedded. What we research, how we research it, and sometimes even what the results of that, not sometimes, very often, what the results of that research are, is culturally steered and interpreted. Science from the time of like rampant colonialism, you can read it, it's fascinating, it's appalling, is all about how there is scientific proof that the European humans are superior to all other races in the world. Right? And that therefore the treatment of other people, especially people from Africa, who aren't even considered people scientifically, of the science of that time, right? Now that is something that we now see as very, very culturally embedded, and something that we need to remember as we think about us being fish in the water, that our current science is equally culturally embedded, and will always be. A great source on this, especially the treatment of women throughout sort of the history of science, is Angela Saini's Inferior, which I cannot recommend enough, but she really, really unpacks all of these ways in which science has sort of all these cultural components. And so if we treat it computationally, then we lend a certain level of objectivity to the results that is actually quite limiting. On the interpersonal level, this is actually something that is getting more and more attention because this has to do with algorithmic bias, right? Which is equally where we see sort of the strains of the computational paradigm. So let's say we want to run an algorithm that's going to find us new employees, much like Amazon did. So we have to find people, maybe based on their identity, right? And we have a sort of computational view on how that works. Input, output, all of these things lead to identity. Of course, what we don't want is a sexist algorithm. So let's take gender out, right? Now we have a safe, great algorithm, and we can use it to find the best people. Except that this is not at all how it works. Right? Remember that sort of like reality over here and the way that computers work over here. This is maybe how computers work, but reality works somewhat more like this. Obviously it doesn't, because this is also a model, right? And turtles all the way down. But if you see identity sort of made up in the mesh of all of that, and what happened with Amazon is if you take gender out, all the connections continue to exist, right? And so you can actually really easily establish, like Amazon's algorithm did, who are, for instance, the women. What happened was they had this algorithm that they trained on previous hires and on previous employees. They said, we don't want gender to be a part of it, so they took gender out, and the algorithm within no time found a way to exclude women based on the language that they use, based on the colleges that they went to, based on their previous pay from previous jobs, because women are paid less, etc. And so it was able to find a way to weed out women. Amazon didn't use this algorithm. right? They chose not to deploy and they actually reported on it themselves. So I suppose good on them. So the point I want to make here is that the risk of computational thinking is that it is a reductive way of thinking, by definition, which is also what empowers us to do so many things, but the limit of that is that it is, therefore, a limited view on the world, and it obscures insights into the division of power, and insights into the division of how the world works. There's another risk here. If you see this, right? This is, let's say, Amazon's algorithm. Why did it weed out women? Does anyone know? Because historically, Amazon hired way more men. Because historically, Amazon paid men much more. Because historically, Amazon usually let women go before they let men go. Does that sound like innovation, or just like a recreation of more of the same? Right? That's what computers do. They find patterns, they recreate, they do the same, but they can't do that innovative, new way of thinking because they're not creative. Right? So if you want to do more of what you've already been doing, use a computer. If you want to do something new, use humans. Because so the risk here is that computational models strengthen the existing status quo, strengthen the existing power structures, but they actually don't innovate on their own. They don't change things on their own. That's where you come in.